Right now, somewhere under the murky water of a Louisiana bayou, about 30 miles east of New Orleans, there are the underwater ruins of the oldest Asian American community ever built on U.S. soil. And it was built by Filipino sailors in 1763. That's before the United States even existed. But here's the thing, historians still argue about exactly how they got there. Like, how does a Filipino sailor end up in a Louisiana swamp in the 1700s? That is not a short trip. And the answer involves one of the most insane trade routes in all of human history, a pirate named Jean Lafitte, and, I promise this is real, a war against the British. By the end of this video, you're going to know the full secret story of the Manilamen, the Filipino sailors who built a hidden village in the Louisiana Bayou, helped save America in a major battle, and literally invented the dried shrimp industry that Louisiana is still famous for today. And you've probably never heard their names, ever. So buckle up. We're going back to 1565, to the biggest, richest, most dangerous trade route the world had ever seen. And somewhere along that route, something went very, very wrong for Spain, and very, very right for Louisiana. Okay, so to understand who the Manilamen were, you need to understand what might be the most bonkers trade route in world history. It's called the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade. From 1565 to 1815, that's 250 years, Spain ran a regular shipping line between Manila in the Philippines and Acapulco in Mexico. And these weren't little boats. These were massive wooden galleons, some of the biggest sailing ships ever built, loaded with Chinese silk, porcelain, spices, and silver. Like obscene amounts of silver. But here's the dark side, and there always is one, right? The Spanish didn't just load these ships with goods, they loaded them with people. Filipino sailors, called Indios by the Spanish, were conscripted, sometimes by force, to crew these massive vessels. The voyage from Manila to Acapulco alone took 6 to 9 months across the open Pacific. Think about that. 6 to 9 months at sea, in brutal conditions, with no choice about whether you went or not. Scurvy, storms, disease. The death toll on some voyages was catastrophic. Now, when these galleons docked at Acapulco, which was basically the western terminus of Spanish colonial trade in the Americas, something interesting started happening. Filipino sailors started disappearing. They'd help unload cargo and then vanish into Mexico. Some settled in Mexican coastal towns, some moved further. Historians have actually documented Filipino-descended communities in Mexico dating back to the 1600s. But a specific group, and nobody knows exactly how many, eventually made their way north and east, to a French colonial territory called Louisiana. So here's what we know for certain, and historians do debate the details, so I'm going to be straight with you. The earliest documented accounts from Harper's Weekly in 1883, that's the first major article ever written about Filipino Americans, by the way, describe a Filipino community at a place called Saint Malo that had been there for about 50 years from that point. That puts documented settlement around the 1830s. But oral traditions and the Filipino American National Historical Society recognize 1763 as the founding date, the year Filipino sailors jumped ship from a Spanish schooner that had docked in New Orleans. And that specific account was recorded by New Orleans historian Marina Espina. Whatever the exact year, what these men built in the Louisiana Bayou is genuinely remarkable. They found a stretch of marsh along the shores of Lake Borgne. That's in what's now St. Bernard Parish, about 30 miles east of New Orleans, and they built a village. And not just any village, they built stilt houses. Houses on wooden stilts rising out of the marsh water. And here's the cool part. Journalist Lafcadio Hearn, who visited in 1883, described the houses as being built in true Manila style. These guys literally recreated Filipino architecture in a Louisiana swamp. That's wild. And these weren't just refugees hiding in a swamp. They were innovators. The Manilamen brought with them a fishing and food preservation technique from back home: dried shrimp. Now, Louisiana had shrimp, lots of shrimp, but nobody there had ever thought to boil them, brine them, and then spread them out on platforms in the sun to dry. The Manilamen did. And they even developed what eyewitnesses called the shrimp dance. Workers literally stamping the shells off dried shrimp with their feet on wooden platforms. By the late 1800s, Louisiana was exporting millions of pounds of dried shrimp to Asia and the Americas. And it all started with these guys. And the community itself was fascinating. By the mid-1800s, Saint Malo had grown to about 150 Filipino fishermen. They spoke a mix of Spanish, Tagalog, and Cebuano. They were deeply Catholic, as most Filipinos were, thanks to centuries of Spanish rule. And critically, they were free. The village operated almost entirely outside U.S. governmental control. No census, no formal government oversight, just a community of guys who had escaped colonial bondage and built something entirely their own. I mean, honestly, that's kind of incredible, isn't it? Real quick, before we get to the battle, the pirate, and the hurricane that ended everything, I want to ask you something. Drop it in the comments right now. Did you learn about the Manilamen in school? Because I am genuinely curious how many people actually knew this story. I'll be reading the comments. All right, let's talk about Jean Lafitte. Okay, Jean Lafitte. If you don't know this name, here's the short version. Jean Lafitte was a French-born smuggler, privateer, and pirate who operated out of Barataria Bay, that's just south of New Orleans. And he was good at it, like embarrassingly good. He ran a whole operation, warehouses, a fleet of ships, hundreds of men, right under the nose of American authorities. And here's the thing about his crew, the Baratarians, as they were called. Historians estimate that over half of Lafitte's pirates were Manilamen, Filipino sailors who had deserted Spanish ships and found their way to the most lawless stretch of the Louisiana Gulf Coast. And honestly, it makes total sense why they'd join up. These were men who had escaped from one of the most oppressive forced labor systems in history, the Spanish galleon trade. They were skilled sailors. They knew artillery. They understood naval tactics. And Lafitte offered them something Spain never did: pay, autonomy, and no questions asked about where you came from. The Baratarian operation was basically the most ethnically diverse, off-the-books maritime force in North America, and the Manilamen were a core part of it. Now, 1814. The War of 1812 is raging, and things are looking very bad for the United States. The British had already burned Washington, D.C., like literally burned the White House. And now a massive British fleet was sailing toward New Orleans. If they took New Orleans, they controlled the entire Mississippi River trade system. The whole western United States, basically. American General Andrew Jackson knew he was in trouble. He didn't have enough trained soldiers, he didn't have enough artillery, and he needed help, fast. So Jackson did something wild. He made a deal with Jean Lafitte. He basically said, "Look, I know you're a pirate. I know you smuggle goods. I don't care. I need your men, your cannons, and your knowledge of this bayou." Lafitte agreed, and with him came his Baratarian crew, which, remember, included a massive number of Manilamen. Filipino sailors who had been living in the Louisiana Bayou, in some cases for decades, now finding themselves fighting for a country that didn't even officially acknowledge they existed. January 8th, 1815, the Battle of New Orleans. The British attacked with around 8,000 troops, one of the most disciplined armies in the world. Jackson had fewer men, a motley alliance of American regulars, Tennessee and Kentucky riflemen, free black soldiers, Choctaw warriors, Creole militia, Lafitte's Baratarians, and yes, the Manilamen. What followed was one of the most lopsided battlefield victories in American military history. The British suffered over 2,000 casualties, the Americans, less than 100. Historians specifically note the Baratarians' expert artillery work as a decisive factor, And the Manilamen, skilled with cannons from their days on the galleons, were right in the middle of it. Okay, real quick, let me just hit you with some numbers, because I feel like you need to appreciate how insane this is. The Battle of New Orleans, British losses, approximately 2,042. American losses, 71. The ratio of British to American casualties is roughly 28-1. The British army that attacked? It had just defeated Napoleon's forces in Europe. These were elite soldiers. And a ragtag Bayou crew, including Filipino sailors who had escaped forced labor on Spanish ships, helped annihilate them. I mean, come on. And then, here's the thing that should bother you. After the battle, history basically forgot them. The victory was celebrated. Andrew Jackson became a national hero. Lafitte got some recognition. But the Manilamen went back to the Bayou, back to Saint Malo, back to drying shrimp on wooden platforms above the marsh. Not in the history books, not in the school curriculum, just invisible. For a group of men who helped save a major American city, that's a pretty rough deal. Fast forward to 1883. A journalist and writer named Lafcadio Hearn, who was, honestly, one of the most interesting writers of the 19th century, travels to Saint Malo and writes a feature article for Harper's Weekly. This becomes the first mainstream account ever written about Filipino Americans, and what he described blew his readers' minds. He wrote about these men rising, quote, out of the shuddering reeds, in their Manila-style stilt-houses, speaking a mixture of Spanish and Philippine languages, living a life completely separate from the rest of America. Harper's Weekly ran illustrations alongside the article. People in New York were absolutely floored that this community existed. Saint Malo wasn't the only settlement either. Over the decades, other Filipino communities formed nearby. Most notably, a place called Manila Village, situated in Barataria Bay, the same waters Jean Lafitte once called home. By the late 1800s, Manila Village had become the more prosperous of the two communities, with dozens of stilt houses, multiple shrimp drying platforms, and a small fleet of fishing boats. The Manilamen were still predominantly male. Getting wives and families over from the Philippines was nearly impossible given immigration laws. But the community was tight-knit and self-sustaining. So what was daily life actually like for these guys? You wake up before dawn, before the Louisiana sun turns the bayou into a sauna, and you take your lugger out into Lake Borgne to set nets. You're pulling in thousands of pounds of brown shrimp, white shrimp, sometimes speckled trout or redfish. You bring them back to the platforms, boil them in huge iron pots with salt, then spread them to dry in the sun. The smell is, by all accounts, spectacular, in a way that your neighbors maybe don't entirely appreciate. Then you stomp the shells off, the shrimp dance, bag the dried shrimp, and ship them to New Orleans markets. And then, apparently, you play music and probably argue about fishing spots, just like anyone else. And then, 1893, October 1st and 2nd. The Cheniere Caminada hurricane makes landfall on the Louisiana Gulf Coast, a Category 4 storm by modern standards. Storm surges of 10 to 16 feet. And Saint Malo, a village built on wooden stilts barely above the marsh water, takes a devastating hit. The hurricane flattened the village, killed many. The survivors scattered, some to other parts of Louisiana, some further. The community that had survived Spanish galleons, Louisiana bayous, pirates, war, and neglect was largely destroyed in a single night. But Manila Village survived. In Barataria Bay, the community rebuilt and continued. Some of the Saint Malo survivors moved there. Manila Village actually prospered through the early 20th century. It was eventually recognized as a legally distinct Filipino fishing community in Louisiana. And then, in 1915, another massive hurricane, this one hit the remaining structures at Saint Malo and further diminished the broader community. Survivors assimilated into New Orleans, and a community that had existed for well over 100 years slowly became a footnote. A forgotten footnote. And here's where it gets almost surreal. Today, right now, in 2025, Climate change and coastal erosion are actively threatening the underwater archaeological remains of Saint Malo. The site sits beneath the water of Lake Borgne and St. Bernard Parish marshlands. Researchers and Filipino American community advocates are literally racing against time to document what remains before it disappears entirely. The wooden pilings, the foundations of those stilt houses, the history of an entire community, still down there, slowly disintegrating. Some things, it seems, never stop being erased. But here's the legacy that didn't get erased. That shrimp drying technique the Manilamen brought from the Philippines, it became the foundation of Louisiana's commercial shrimping industry. Today, Louisiana is one of the top shrimp-producing states in the entire United States. The Gulf shrimping industry generates billions of dollars, and it traces, in a very real, direct line, back to Filipino fishermen on wooden stilts in the Bayou, doing the shrimp dance in the 1800s. The next time you eat shrimp in Louisiana, you know who to thank. In 2019, the Filipino American community finally got something. A historical marker was installed at 1345 Bayou Road in St. Bernard Parish, inside the Los Isleños complex, officially recognizing Saint Malo as the first Filipino and Asian American settlement in the United States. It took 256 years to get a sign, but the sign is there. And for Filipino Americans tracing their roots, and for historians who believe in telling the full story of America, not just the convenient parts, it matters enormously. And here's why this story matters, beyond just being a cool historical fact. The Manilamen represent something that keeps showing up if you look closely enough at American history. Marginalized groups who built, fought, innovated, and survived, and then got written out of the official story. Filipino Americans, Black Americans, Native Americans, Chinese railroad workers. The full story of how this country was built involves a lot of people whose names don't appear in the standard textbooks. The Manilamen helped build Louisiana. They fought in its defense, they fed its people, and for most of American history, nobody was taught their names. So let's come full circle. Remember that underwater bayou we started with? The old pilings under Lake Borgne? Those are the bones of a village built by men who crossed one of the world's most dangerous oceans, not by choice, but because they were forced to. Men who then chose freedom over safety and built something entirely their own in the most unlikely place imaginable. Men who fought for a country that didn't officially acknowledge them. Men who fed a region with a fishing technique from half a world away. The Manilamen were here, they mattered, and now you know about them. And here's the thing. The Manilamen are just one chapter of a much larger, mostly untold story. Because the Manila-Acapulco galleon trade didn't just create Filipino settlements in Louisiana, it created Filipino communities in Mexico. It connected Asia, the Americas, and Europe in a single trade network 400 years before the internet. It pumped so much silver into the global economy that some historians argue it literally created the modern financial system. That is a whole other video, and trust me, you want to see it. If this story hit different, if you learned something genuinely new today, hit that like button. Seriously, it helps more than you know. Subscribe if you want more of these hidden history deep dives. And share this one, because honestly, the Manilamen deserve to have their story told to as many people as possible. I'll see you in the next one.